Hi, I'm Brian, and today I want to show you how to cut box joints with thick fingers using only a thin finger box joint jig. By the way, I've also written a post on my blog about this technique. If you'd prefer to read about it, the link is in the description. Many people have shared tutorials for how to make this simple finger or box joint jig. I'll link a few so you can make your own. It's simple enough to make that the advice is when you want to make a joint with a different size finger, just make another jig. I've done this a few times, and the reason to do it is if you match the size of the pin to the width of a dado blade, then you can cut the whole gap for a finger at once. But last week I broke my dado blade. I still wanted to make a joint with thicker fingers, so I spent some time figuring out how to do it with a jig matched to the thickness of my rip blade. This is that jig, and this is the project. I'm pretty happy with how it came out, so let me show you how I did it. These are the pieces for a box I'm going to make today. I'm hoping that the lighter and darker colors will be easy to see on camera so you can tell which way I'm putting the piece through the jig. So what I have here is a jig whose pin is matched to the size of my rip blade and the spacer that I would normally use to make thin finger joints. I'm going to set the spacer aside for now. The way I start setting up for the thick finger joint is to find two pieces of wood that are the exact thickness of the tooth that I want in my joint. I want a square tooth that's the same width as the thickness of the wood. So I'm just going to use pieces from the project itself to space the pin from the blade. All I do is I set it up with the spacers against the blade and move the pin over. Then I check to make sure that the blade isn't too tight against the pieces of wood. By the way, my saw is unplugged while I'm doing this. And when I'm happy with where that is, I clamp the jig in place. With the jig clamped in place, I place a scrap against the end of the jig that is nearest the pin, not nearest the saw, and clamp it in place. Now I remove the tooth spacers and unclamp the jig, and then I scoot it over and place the thin rip spacer in between the jig and the scrap. And I move the jig back over against the thin rip spacer that is against the scrap and clamp it down again. Now I can remove the scrap and the spacer, and I'm ready to start making cuts. You might notice that I've used this jig before and the teeth are not lined up with that slot. That was a slightly smaller tooth. So I've also prepared a backer board to reduce tear out on the new workpieces. This next bit is going to go exactly like you have seen in other videos. I'm going to place the top end of my workpiece against the pin and push it through the saw. That will create a slot, and then I will move the slot over the pin, make another cut, move that slot over the pin, and so on until I reach the end of the board. That was both ends of the opposing sides of the box. Now I need to cut the cross pieces. To line that up, this will be very similar to how the jig is shown in other people's videos. We're going to leave it as it is. We're going to take the top end of the piece we cut and push it over the pin. That gives us a nice alignment down to the edge of the blade. And so we take the matching end and put its top piece against the top piece that we just put in there. And I like to clamp this in place, because after I've got it clamped in place, I like to remove the other piece. Theoretically, the blade shouldn't touch this, but this just makes sure it doesn't. From here, we're going to make the same set of cuts. I'll cut this, and then I'll put that slot over the pin, cut the next one, and so on. So what we've just done is cut one edge of all the teeth. And it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that this edge lines up with this edge, and this edge lines up with this edge. So now what we need to do is cut the other side of each of the teeth. To do that, we need to reset where the jig is. Where we need the jig to be for these next cuts is exactly one tooth width away from the blade. So we'll loosen it up, and we'll grab a piece of our material again, and put that right against the blade, move the pin up against it, make sure it's not too tight. That feels pretty good. So now we'll clamp it down again. For the second cuts on each piece, we're going to move through the saw in the opposite direction as where we did it. So we went this way to cut the first set. We're going to go this way to cut the second set. The reason for that is we want this nice tight pin fit again. And when we cut this first slot, it's going to cut a slot right next to where we cut before. If the finger width we're looking for is not at least twice the size of the blade we're using, then we will have one big slot and we won't have a tight fit around that pin. That's okay, you just have to hold the wide slot against the right edge of the pin, but it's easy to forget which slot you're supposed to move into next if you're doing that. So by going this way, we always know which slot we're going to move into next, and it's always a nice tight fit around that pin. An additional thing to watch out for, we're going to start with the piece that has the tooth on the top edge. When you set up the bottom edge of that piece, you might have an overhang here that means the blade is going to cut a partial tooth. You have two options. You can go ahead and cut that, or you can leave it and not cut it and just go straight to the second position. If you leave it and don't cut it, then you don't have to set the jig up again. If you do cut it, you'll have to modify the jig setup one more time, because what you'll end up with is a thin pin on the other piece that you'll need to trim off the inside edge, and you can't get the spacing accurate without resetting the jig. So I got lucky on this one. I don't have a partial cutout here. That means I'm gonna go to the second slot to start anyway, but it means that I won't have to do another setup. And basically this will just be my off-size pin. Now we're going to cut the cross pieces that started with the slot. This one also moves through the opposite way, but we also flip the piece over so that the top is pointed toward the blade to start again. It doesn't make any sense to put that one on there, so we start in the first full slot, not the half slot. And we just make all the cuts all the way down again. When we get to the bottom, we're going to cut that slot, but we're not going to make a cut with the bottom edge against the pin because this pin will be removed later. It's not going to end up part of the final joint. So now that we've made all those cuts, you can see a little more easily how all these teeth are going to line up. Get it right like that, you can see that the edges are all correct. And now we just have this sliver in the middle of all of our gaps. And that's because I chose a finger size that is a little bit more than double the width of my blade. If it had been double or less, that gap would be gone and our joint would be finished, except for this little end on the cross piece. This out here needs to be removed so that we get a full-size gap. This is also where things would be different if I had had a partial gap on this piece. Then I would need to cut this tooth quite precisely.
It should be possible to set the jig up one more time to do that, but I haven't had a chance to test it. So I will save that for another video.
But for now, what we need to do is take the jig off so that we can cut out all of these little fins in the bottoms of our gaps. We can take the jig off because I'm just going to cut out these fins by eye. Since I'm using a crosscut sled and I have basically zero clearance between the edge of my blade and the sides of this, it's very easy to put the fin over that gap and make sure there's space on either side of the gap and push it through, and the blade won't mess with either edge of the rest of the teeth. And because I'm an amateur video producer, I forgot to push the record button while I was sawing out the fins. But they're out now, and it's time to see if this fits together. So here's my two A marks. We will put those just like so. That is not a bad fit. Let's get the rest of the box together. Feels just a little loose, but that'll leave some room for glue, so I'm not worried. There's B. Here's C and D. They go like so. Those look okay. So, that is a box joint jig with fingers wider than my table saw blade. So that's the process. I'm pretty happy with how this joint turned out. It looks like it's moving a little bit, but just a little bit of glue in there will snug that up, no problem. There's hardly any gap. If I use the right colored glue or sand just a little dust into there, it will not be noticeable at all. I hope this helps someone. I know it's pretty easy to go out and buy a dado blade, but if yours blew up and you can't use it, this works pretty well. There are a couple issues with this method. One of them is that, as you can see, it takes a lot more cuts and some extra setup to set up as opposed to a dado blade. If you don't have a dado blade, this is kind of irrelevant. You can do this or you can go buy a dado blade. The other issue with it is that it's really hard to make a test joint before you commit to making the joint itself, because you have to reset the jig in the middle. It's very hard to tell if that first set of cuts was as accurate as you want, because you're talking about, you know, thousandths of an inch between loose and tight. So the best you can do for that is make sure that your jig that you're clamping to, whether it's a crosscut jig or a miter gauge, is accurate. And then also make sure that the thin rip joint that you're using has been tested and you're sure that the spacer is correct and all that kind of stuff. If that's accurate and you've gotten used to how tight the saw blade should be, you should be able to set this up and get a pretty good box joint of any size. Anyway, I hope this helps someone and you go make something fun in your shop. Thanks for watching.